Agen Cave is 20.2 miles or 5 kilometer, one of the longest cavern frameworks in ridges in the UK. The cavern is fixed with a weighty metal entryway that must be opened with a remarkable key. You need to go through a thorough evaluation cycle to procure the key. The metal entryway should be locked consistently after entering Agen Allwedd Voyager's face, a progression of contracted serpentine halls. Prompting the principal stone gag focuses, the underlying investigation stage includes navigating through extensive claustrophobic entryways, requiring actual effort. Furthermore, difficult situation creeping. It's difficult to overcome these parts, yet in the event that you're sufficiently little and not hesitant to get stuck, you can do it with this underground labyrinth. The stupendous circle stands apart as an eminent course. This roundabout way wanders towards the focal entry, highlighting 4 particular rock stifle. Focuses each with its own exceptional deterrence, the southern stream entry is one more critical course portrayed by its hazardous water-filled segments and requesting actual difficulties testing the mettle of. Experienced cavers should be aware of the potential for flooding. Particularly in stormy circumstances, the gamble is especially intense at the 3rd rock stifle, where water can impede entry and, in outrageous circumstances, access. Past this point, including the subsequent stone gag, becomes risky from the get-go. An exhaustive investigation of the UK's buckling districts uncovered many water-filled caves that had not been completely investigated, with many left over unmapped, these caverns especially. Those considered significant or promising drew the consideration of youthful cavers like Imprint and Farr, who needed to substantiate themselves. A repeating issue in this field was the disclosure of lowered entries that, albeit ideal for investigation, had previously been guaranteed by other cavers. Martin needed to be the first to find the most powerful and eventually perilous cavern sections. Martin Farr is known as a legend in the worldwide buckling and cavern jumping people group and has been instrumental in finding broad cavern sections across different nations taking part in and buckling since the youthful age of 10. Martin's energy for the discipline was obvious from the get-go, prompting his most memorable disclosure of new caverns by the age of 16. Roger Sunbase's interest with caves started in the early years around the age of 12, and the backwoods around the area where he resided, which was the town of Dignitary. This underlying interest bloomed into a profound comprehension of the area's topography and cavern structures. His investigation endeavors were predominantly centered around revealing in the Slippery Woodland Expert Framework, a speculative organization of interconnected collapses. The idea was that this large number of caverns were associated underground, and you could get through the entries and find the connection or that unique association with caves on the opposite side of the nation or the world. Martin Farr's most memorable experience with Roger happened during Roger's underlying year at college. They truly confided in one another, and they were both entirely dependable individuals, so they made for truly old buddies. Roger was known for his faithfulness and frequently trusting that hours for individuals will accumulate buckling gear and prepare when he was typically the first to get inside the cavern, while Martin was the person who got a kick out of the chance to go off and investigate various segments of the cavern and sort of face more challenge. He was likewise somewhat more modest and extremely quick and solid. Martin was keen on investigating the Letic region, where Aegina with Cave was. In spite of the potential for critical revelations, admittance to the lowered entries in this district was frequently confined, because of the fact that it was so hazardous to investigate them during this period explicitly in 1971 and 1972. Striking plunging investigations were led in the Agen Allwedd Cave by John Parker anyway. He sort of got worn out from the entirety of the jumping, and he was doing it generally without anyone else, and he likewise saw that he was committing a few errors that he wouldn't, for the most part, make while cave investigating, which might have cost him his life. He concluded it would be a protected call to enjoy some time off from investigating the risky segments of water-topped caverns and leave it off to another person for a tad, somebody hungry to become well-known. Somebody like Martin Farr. Martin caught wind of John's break, so he and his companion Roger Salary arranged an undertaking to proceed with the investigation to the Agen Allwedd cave. Their goal was to go past where John Parker had halted anyway. As arrangements were in progress in May, Roger hurt his knee downright horrendous, while on a buckling trip, making him unfit to endure the physic-ical requests of the endeavor. He knew that in the event that he endeavored it with that knee injury, there would be a decent opportunity that he could destroy himself and Martin in the cavern. The venture included exploring through a mile-long testing segment of the southeast stream section. With this challenge, Martin and Roger concurred that Martin would direct the underlying investigation without help from anyone else. The arrangement was to assess the difficulties and see what was in that cavern, and the entry and assemble. However, much data as could be expected, particularly the ones that were loaded up with water, should the circumstances be to some degree safe and Roger's well-being. Ideally get better, they planned to investigate it together later on, going more profound into the cavern's unknown regions. Yet this is the kind of thing that they would need to do together on the grounds that it was so perilous down there in mid-May 1974. Martin entered the Agen Allwedd cave. He was outfitted with 3 jumping air tanks lashed on his back, an essential decision that empowered him to dive exceptionally deep without help from anyone else in the cavern, and have some additional air in the event something turned out badly, which was entirely conceivable. He, at last, outperformed the investigated segments recently set by John Parker. He got a gigantic adrenaline rush from this, and he, yet again, couldn't hold on to report back to Roger with the uplifting news. Then he chose to progress forward and went roughly 100 FT more. Past this point, and in all out right down the cavern, he was around 1,300 FT from the headquarters where he had the remainder of his stuff. Martin then arose into a tremendous, neglected entry. He was ecstatic, yet at the same time needed to go further. Then he eliminated his plunging hardware and put it down on a rock bank. This is the sort of thing that he needed to do to fit through these different sections that were more claustrophobic, and it was absolutely impossible that he would fit through with that additional stuff. After that, the cavern area had completely open entries, so he could sort of stroll around unreservedly and not need to stress over helping through these little segments. Contrastingly, it likewise presents segments of extensive profundity and slenderness. So there's little sections inside that Goliath one that you can slip into or investigate, assuming you need to these fragments. Remembered unpredictable fractures for regions lowered in profound water, presenting critical difficulties as far as both getting around them and security. He could feel his heart thumping out of his chest as he strolled around this monster entry, and afterward attempted to go into a portion of the more modest ones. He got into one of the more modest sections that was so close he could hear the stones scratching profound into his back and sides as he attempted to propel himself through. He could scarcely move his arms or his head. The main thing he could do was squirm to the point of attempting to push ahead. Subsequent to crossing around 1,500 FT altogether in this colossal section, he saw that something was evolving inside the cavern, and that the roof was beginning to plunge. It demonstrated the logical presence of another water-filled entry, which is something that he was searching for. That this is where he would need to go with Roger. Martin's speculation was affirmed. When not far off, he experienced the 4th lowered entry, and presently he would need to switch around his underlying methodology and plans to explore this choking segment. He would not have been ready to do it without that gear that he left behind. The revelation of this new section was met with significant festival and a pride. It was a gigantic arrangement, and he knew it. And at this point, Roger was really feeling improved. So presently he could join Martin, and they might EXP at any point investigate past that 3rd entry and dive deep into the cavern. For this one, they would need to explore through the first lowered or water-filled sections, which they had the option to manage with practically no issues. Martin brought him straight up to the place where he was before he turned around after arriving at that 4th lowered section. Anyway, the companions encountered a startling change in their state of mind. They were in extremely cheerful moods. However, the two of them began to feel a feeling of uneasiness. This was a strange region. They were having a commonplace mental reaction, even with these obscure perils, and the adrenaline rush that they, whenever had, was totally wore off. Notwithstanding this, they realized they couldn't surrender, and continued further into the claustrophobic fourth entry. They saw that they need to go through this multitude of various exciting bends in the road to forge ahead without precedent for their common buckling history. Martin and Roger both chose to jump one next to the other. This is the sort of thing that isn't exhorted in the cavern, plunging local area. Most cavern jumpers work their direction down entries one before different. They pursued this choice strategically, tending to the difficulties of the section in this high-risk climate. They knew that assuming something turned out badly down there, they would require prompt help, and assuming they were plunging one before the other, whoever was behind could go down the wrong entry and be lost everlastingly. Now that they understood what their arrangement was going into this waterfill segment they were stood up to with wavering to continue, they chose decisively that they planned to leave their buckling boots behind on a mud bank at the entry to the lowered section. This choice, while surprising, was their thought process was best in light of the novel states of the section. Roger went in, first setting out a rule reel simultaneously. Martin was there close to him, roughly 5-membered away, furnished with an extra T000FT of line, fully expecting a tedious jump. This arrangement was basic for en route and security in the unknown. Lowered section. This line would be their best way to get out presently into the plunge. Roger started encountering sinus gives, an issue that he had occasionally, so it didn't appear to be an immense arrangement. However, it generally happened when they were at expanded profundities. Martin knew about this, and he realized that Roger some of the time had this occur, so he motioned toward him to propose perhaps pivoting and going back and reevaluate what they planned to do. Anyway, Roger didn't have any desire to do that. He was driven by sheer assurance to push forward for finding the neglected section, and he picked to forge ahead when Roger's line completely reached out to 400 FT into the entry. It became apparent to Martin that they were plummeting to critical profundities, roughly 50 FA underneath the surface, with the section proceeding to slant downwards. Martin's appraisal of his strain measure demonstrated that he was moving toward the third furthest reaches of his air.
Supply flagging that he would before long have to escape that surrender to natural air. He was likewise mindful of the component that Roger's air supply was somewhat, not as much as his. This was on the grounds that Roger had more modest chambers, as he was a greater individual, and he wanted those more modest ones to fit through the tight entries. Regardless, Martin chose to continue conveying, submerged with Roger, that he would proceed with the investigation, and proposing that Roger just turned
around, expecting Roger paid attention to him and would turn around to escape that section. Martin just forged ahead with proceeding the entry, kept on plunging down. And 150 FT later, Martin understood that he had surpassed his third air limit, arriving where he ought to have proactively been coming back out of that section after rising his lofty rock bank. His tension check affirmed. He was all the way into the second third of his third air supply save, driven by an inward conviction to press on. Martin immediately climbed the rock slant at around 50 T, F'd up. He expected to experience an air pocket that would permit him to momentarily reprieve and redesign prior to going on, as he rose roughly 3 FT underneath the water surface. The tricky quest for air turned out to be more frantic. Martin's environmental elements show no sign of an air pocket, with the water step staying predictable. He began to overreact and had zero control over his breathing. His vision was obscured and he felt caught in a strong choice. He turned right, betting on the possibility finding air in this neglected course. It was his main choice to hold himself back from suffocating in the entry, having explored more profound into a strange lowered section. He wound up in a dubious circumstance, subsequent to wandering further into an Al Bay. The entry unexpectedly restricted, flagging the finish of the traversable course at this crossroads. Martin acknowledged he was fundamentally out of air, elevating the desperation of his circumstance. The anxiety of the plunge were mounting dramatically as he arranged to leave the restricted section. He encountered an elevated feeling of stretching the boundaries excessively far while endeavoring to withdraw from the section he experienced Roger. Situated above him close to the cavern roof at a profundity of roughly 3 feet, so they were simply close to the top. The startling gathering required quick, submerged correspondence and decision-making. Martin showed to Roger the earnest need to escape the enclosure, focusing on their getaway. Martin left the plunge reel and took cues from Roger, with the two jumpers confronting fundamentally low air supplies, the most profound mark of their process, arrived at roughly 70 at a profundity that, in this manner, escalated the mental difficulties they looked as. Martin climbed through the entry. He encountered a charming ear torment and an extreme migraine side effects frequently connected with fast changes in strain in the actual effort of cavern jumping, in spite of clearing his ears and momentarily stopping at the crossroads of the lines. Martin knew that his measure showed that he was out of air. The acknowledgement that he was unable to bear to look for Roger on the off chance that he had fallen behind constrained Martin to proceed with his rising out. Of the cavern alone after surfacing, Martin encountered a mind-boggling feeling of, yet again, help having arrived at an air surface anyway. This help was immediately eclipsed by the beginning of an extraordinary cerebral pain, an expected mark of decompression disorder. The seriousness of the migraine left him in a province of desolation. He ended up in a territory of shock and acknowledgement as he remained in the cavern pool. The full weightiness of the circumstance was gradually occurring to him, especially the shortfall of his jumping accomplice. Roger Martin's prompt reaction was to stand by the entrance, a choice they had made previously. They entered. He pondered the various events where Roger had hung tight for him during past campaigns, highlighting the significance of tolerance and trust in the unsure and frequently deceptive cavern jumping climate. This time of stalling was full of serious tension and consideration, as Martin grabbed with the expected results of the plunge and the destiny of his accomplice while holding up. Martin firmly noticed the water's surface for any sign of Roger's return, for example, a jerk on the rule or any indication of development. Anyway, the water stayed still with just a little mass of froth inactively flowing in the pool, enhancing the feeling of vulnerability and worry. After roughly an hour, he understood the vanity of detached pausing, and chose to make a move regardless of the dangers implied. Recognizing his exhausted air supply, he chose to direct a restricted observation of the initial 100 ft of the lowered section. This choice was made in anticipation of finding Roger or acquiring some kind of understanding into his circumstance. Martin painstakingly ready for this optional plunge, deciding on a solitary air chamber. He was utilizing one of the air chambers that they left before they initially entered this cavern, and he picked the one that had a couple of climates of air still inside, which was a perilous choice on his part since he really wanted this air to help back through those water-filled segments to escape the cavern. So via looking for Roger, he might actually run out of air and not have to, the point of getting out himself consequently, kicking the bucket, entering the water. Martin started to pull on the rule purposefully, guaranteeing that it was educated to keep away from ensnarement, a basic security measure in cave jumping. During this cycle, he saw that the line was slack, demonstrating an absence of pressure that could propose different situations, including the chance of Roger having previously passed this point or an issue with the actual line. Martin proceeded to carefully pull the line, trying to lay out a discussion association and continue with his exploratory and salvage exertion of Roger anyway as he pulled. The line he promptly saw a peculiarity. The line was coming in too easily. This simplicity of recovery drove Martin to a disturbing acknowledgement. The line was not generally moored or connected to anything. Such a circumstance is profoundly uncommon in cave plunging, where rules are fastidiously secure to forestall confusion and to help with route during both section and takeoff from the cavern. Perceiving the seriousness of this disclosure mark, and kept on recovering the line, pulling it in consistently, a surprising revelation was made. The Line had been obviously cut off, demonstrative of a purposeful cut, in all likelihood made with a blade. The finding drove Martin to an upsetting end in regards to Roger. It appeared to be plausible that Roger, during his endeavor to leave the lowered entry, had become trapped in the line, and a frantic endeavor to free himself. He would have no real option except to cut the line, this demonstration, while fundamental, for sure, fire getaway probably brought about Roger losing his direction inside the section, or more terrible, depleting his excess air supply. Martin comprehended that any further activity on his part would be medieval and possibly dangerous to himself in the work to find Roger. He would have to caution salvage with overwhelming sadness and a reasonable comprehension of the restricted choices. Martin started his own cautious and serious exit from the cavern. He had the option to traverse those other 3 sections and had sufficient air, and afterward he, though by a very narrow margin, called for help. A salvage activity was started John Parker perceived as one of the first specialists in cave. Jumping was brought to lead the basic mission. Anyway, the group's underlying endeavors on Sunday night were obstructed by seriously decreased perceivability, the result of weighty precipitation in south ridges. In spite of their determined endeavors over the course of the night, the hunt group needed to stop their activity because of the failure to find Roger. The group trusted that the circumstances will improve, and on the next Thursday, they continued their pursuit, this time. The activity was reinforced by a group of 10 jumpers, including striking figures, for example, Jim Elliott, John Parker, and Colin Edmond, a neighborhood jumper to the district there. Objective was clear: to explore that last profound entry that Roger was thought to be in and recuperate him. In spite of John Parker's thorough endeavors, Roger's body stayed tricky. JN ultimately surfaced roughly 3 1/2 hours after Colin's return. The group of 10 jumpers assembled to evaluate what is happening, and after cautious consultation settled on the tough decision to end the pursuit. The choice was educated by the need to relieve further dangers. It was simply too hazardous to even think about proceeding to look through down in that 4th section. They recognized the demanding and pointless 10 1/2 hour look for their kindred jumper. The failure to recover R's body from the Agen cave cast a sorry excuse for secret over the episode inside the cavern. Plunging local area hypothesis waited around the chance of Roger becoming entrapped, prompting him cutting the line from the real. His non-attendance left Allwedd with many recollecting Roger Salar's bright soul in fellowship, a demonstration of his effect and heritage in the cavern plunging clique.